Hi everyone, welcome to week 12, day one. I'm starting with what we normally would, like if we were in class, and that is going straight to Google Drive and just showing you where files are. Okay, so this should be very natural for us. We're in week 12 today, day one, and our files are all right here. So before I even get into our video, just make sure that you have your files available while you listen to the video. Also make sure that you have brackets downloaded. So I'm going to go ahead and show you where to do that. Here's Adobe Brackets. Okay, it's free to download and use. I believe that is for Mac and PC. And then, of course, if you read my email, you may have also read that I recommend GIMP if you do not have Adobe Photoshop. GIMP has been around for a long, long time, since the late 90s, I believe. And it's pretty reliable in terms of a free image manipulation software. So let's go over to our schedule right now. That's kind of what we do in class. That's how I'm going to start right now. Here we are, week 12, Monday. We're going to talk today about controlling images and CSS along with sizes. There are some new methods there I'd like to discuss. I'll do my best to try to keep this discussion in a timely manner because it is on video. But today we're going to basically take a look at gradients as well, along with Codecademy. We have a new course there, exercise. It's the same one we had last Friday. It's Make a Website. Let me just point that out since we're on the topic. So in Codecademy, if I were to go to Catalog at the top, and I'm just going to go ahead and choose Web Development here off to the left, you're going to see that module down below right here. If you hear a weird tap right now, it's because I'm using my keyboard. And sometimes what I will do also is record my voice in notes just so that I have a running transcript of things. Now, from time to time, that may cut out, so I may pause. All right, so anyway, we're right back here with Codecademy. Today we're looking at boundaries and space, and that is right here in that syllabus. Last but not least, I'll probably address this in email, of course, and I have been, and that is if you need to meet with me through Zoom during my virtual office hours, let me know. I can arrange that, or you can send me a meeting as well, I believe, and that way we can meet during that time block if that works for you. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to load brackets. So I have that loaded right now. Just make sure you have that on your end and get the files that we need because we're going to go over those together today. So I'm going to start with something like this. This is number one. And then you'll see me switch screens. Okay, so I'll do something like this, and that means I'm going to go straight over to Adobe Acrobat. Okay, so we're going to talk about, first we're going to talk about controlling images in both CSS and kind of going back to HTML as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is just kind of go over this little slide. If you look at the example here on the right-hand side, it's showing you how we can write classes in CSS to control the literal size of these images. But we also need to do the same thing in HTML just so we can pre-render or kind of store the physical space of where that image is going to load before it loads. So I'll show you an example of that. One of the advantages, of course, of determining size in CSS is that if you have many images on your website, you can really do that fast in your style sheets by changing the physical size of an image all at once. So for example, if you had a lot of small thumbnail images, you would want to create in this example, small class with height 144 pixel. I'm going to go back over to brackets. We're going to take a look at an example of this just so you have a clear idea of what we're doing. Okay, so in this first example here, what you're seeing, of course, is the page on the right-hand side is loaded from brackets. And you're going to see on line 26 something really new to us, and that is the picture element. So the picture element is a new way to basically tell modern browsers, hey, I'm going to give you some options to load the best image that you think the viewer will need. So in our example, it's kind of a rough way to say it, but in our example, we have a few images here. I'm looking right now on line 28 and 30. So we have an image that's medium size and one that's large. And then you'll notice within the picture element, we have our old friend, the image element. You could think of this as like the backup source. So in other words, if a browser doesn't know how to render or interpret the picture element, it'll skip the source right here and here, and it will go straight to image. So I wanted just to kind of show you a sneak peek first of those images before we get too deep into this, so you have an idea of why we're doing it. Something you'll notice is that when I look at the file size for large right here, you can see it's 89 kilobytes. But when I compare it to medium, it's 24 kilobytes, so a significantly lighter weight. So when we're talking about how we can tell a browser to load which type of image, we're really talking about efficiency, how fast our site is going to be. And the picture element really does accommodate that pretty well. Okay, so that's the first example you see in the browser here at the very top. The second example, I'm going to scroll to it, is down below here. And this is a new method as well. And it's more or less telling the browser, hey, I'm going to just offer one image element, but I'm also going to load several images for the browser to choose from. And this is really based on a few different things here. The first, of course, is on line 45, and that's the attribute source set. So source set enables you to load several images all at once, and then the browser determines which one it wants based on its own physical width. So again, we're talking about screen size. The sizes attribute gives us a range, and this is kind of where it gets a little abstract. You can kind of see the CSS-like property here that says max width, 320, and then the one right next to it is 280. So between 320 and 280, we're giving the browser a range of sizes to choose from. Same thing down here below. If we had a bigger screen, it would know to look at max width, 500, and then we have multiple options to choose from. Anywhere to 400 all the way up to 800 pixels wide. Just like what we saw in the first example up here with picture element, something similar is happening here with the image element. You can see that we also have the normal source attribute we would use with that element. So it's kind of considered the default standard. If a browser didn't know how to interpret either of these attributes, it would know to at least load Magnolia Large. And in this case, that's 500 pixels wide. Like we still do with a lot of different images in the past with HTML, we still want to give an alt attribute, giving it context, so that somebody that maybe is visually impaired can make sense of what that image is when the screen reader reads. Whoops, looks like we have a typo here. Illustration of a magnolia flower. Okay, so that's the first example. Let's go back to our slides here really quick, and I'll move on to our next kind of method, and that is how do we align and center align images? And again, here we're talking about CSS primarily. If we go back to our Code 3 assignment, we're really focused on something we've used before once, and that is the float property, how we can float things from the left or to the right. And we're going to take a look at that one more time. So I'll go back to brackets, and we're going to take a look at number 2 here. I will get back to 1A, but we're going to hold tight for just a second. We'll look at number 2. And number 2, let me zoom in to our images. And what we're seeing here is essentially Two images, one goes left, one goes right. Now this is fairly easy to make sense of. I think what we're going to do is we're just going to take a look at really quick of how a developer would write for this. So the first thing you'll notice is that we have on line 18, the image is being sized in its own class, image medium. Okay, so we do that so that if we needed to change all image sizes in the browser, or on our site, I should say, I could do that really quickly here. I could change it from 500 or 250 to 500, and you see what I mean. You can change the image really fast that way. Let me go back and change that to where it was before. The other thing, of course, is floating our images. So we have our first class here, align left. Okay, and we're using that image selector to be very specific. So we just don't want to randomly have this class assigned to anything. We're writing it in CSS so that we know we have clear intent. That class should be tied to the image selector. Float left is what's making this first image go all the way to the left side of the screen. So I scale that out. You can see what I mean. And then we're also giving a slight margin to the right-hand side of the image over here where the text is. Same thing for the align right, but this time, of course, we float that to the right-hand side. Now down below, I mentioned that we need to get back to HTML file 1A. So let me do that really quick. This example really just shows you kind of some practical techniques for when you're managing your images. So if I go and look at the HTML here, all I really wanted to point out was, yes, it's still considered good practice to add your width and height attributes in HTML based on the physical size of that image. It does, however, seem very redundant when we're controlling an image in CSS. The reason, though, that this is still considered best practice is because if you're on a really slow connection, right now might be a really good situation in which that happens, working from home. That area in which the image is going to load will at least block out the physical space using the width and height attributes in HTML. Whereas we're really worried about CSS and controlling the physical width and height of that image. Now there's some tips here. For example, you're seeing how we're doing that by using classes. So if I have class large, you can see that it's being pulled from way up here. Okay, it's just simple width and height values. And I'm sorry, I think I gave up on my transcript notes. It keeps cutting out, pardon me. Anyway, let's get back to this. So we have large, medium, and small. Okay, that's how we're kind of dictating the size in CSS for all images on our site, just in one little style sheet right here. Down below, however, there are some questions there that I want you to read and just kind of make sense of it for yourself. I'll demonstrate that right now a little bit. For example, number 3 says, why is it important to not assign a small image with a large class? Let me show you what I mean by that. On line 28, we have our small image. You can see that it's 100 by 100 pixels. So what I'm saying here is we wanted to be really careful not to just kind of get sloppy and go, oh, well, I can change that small image, which again is right here in the browser, to something like large. And if I said file save, okay, that image gets large. But here's why we wouldn't want to do that. Even though I can manipulate the size in CSS, what I don't want to do is do it like this, because what it does is stretches that physical image out, and you can see that it's really, really blurred. So when an image is physically small to begin with, we just want to be very sensitive not to get in the habit of trying to manipulate it to become bigger by this method. Instead, I would want to assign that a class small, so that if I wanted to change it and become smaller, I could still do that in CSS. So on line 14, for example, where it says width and height, if it is 100, which it should be, let's say I wanted to make that even smaller, something like 60 or 50. okay, you can see that it changes that way. So I can go down when an image is small, but I can't go up because it just distorts the quality of the image. Okay, so I'm looking at the clock. We're making good time. Let me keep going. I mentioned center aligning images, and again, we're going to take a look at an example of that. We looked at how to float an image from the left, or to the left and to the right. Now we're going to look at how we can just center align an image. So let me go back to brackets, and we're going to choose number 3, centering images. In this example, you're going to get 2 different ways to do that. The first method, of course, is the one at the very top right here. And the second one is down below in the browser. So I'll talk about each of these really quickly, I hope. Let's take a look in this example on line 49. Again, we're going to look at the HTML first just to make sense of how it's structured. Okay, so we have our image element here. Really nothing to it. We do have a few classes, align, center, and medium. I'll talk about those in a minute. And then on line 56, we have something similar in terms of structure. But this time, the big difference, of course, is the image is wrapped in a div. And I'm going to explain why that is. So let's focus on our first method here, and that is how do we center align this image using CSS? It's pretty easy. What we're going to take a look at are these 2 classes here. Okay, this is why we look at HTML first. Align center and medium. So let's go up to the top of this page and see where they're at. They're right here on line 19 and line 24. All right, so the first one says, again, we're going to write the selector, and then we're going to write the class. The class always starts with a dot. This time, however, we're going to treat that image like it's a block element. And to do that, we write the property display with a value of block. So in other words, we're treating that image now, way down below here, as if it's like a paragraph. It's on its own visual line in the browser. The next thing is margin, and that is basically telling it to appear as if it's center aligned. But the difference, of course, is the value. The value there's only 2 values. We know margin has 4. So when we see something like this, it's going back to what we learned before spring break. This is something we call writing in shorthand. So if you see a margin that has 2 values like this, in our case, it means the first 0 pixel there means both top and bottom margins of that image. Auto means right and left side of that image. So if I said margin auto in this case, okay, you can imagine this image at the very top has an automatic amount of space where the browser is simulating or emulating that to appear as if it's center aligned. So as the browser is just taking up all that extra room for the physical image element. Now I could change 0px to something like 50. And when I do, you'll see the image over in the browser kind of adds space to the top and bottom part of that image, just like this. So that's kind of just a test to see if in fact that is shorthand. In this case, yes, it is. That's both the top and bottom margin. Finally, the last thing, of course, is if I wanted to change the physical size, I make a new class for that. I don't want to add or jumble this one with this one. Instead, I want to separate those out so I have finite control. So if I wanted to make it any smaller, I could. Remember, I can change that right here. But again, we want it right at 250. Okay, so that's the first method for center aligning an image right here in the HTML. The second example is a little more kind of nuanced. I'll talk about that as well. All right, second method is we're wrapping an image in a div. Let's talk about why that is. You're going to notice that its classes are slightly different. We still have the medium class, which dictates this physical size of that image right here in CSS. But the other class we're using is something called Flex Align. Okay, so let me explain that. I'm going to go up to line 34, and we're going to look at the div. And that is just the selector in CSS. And of course, if you look at the HTML, we only have one div, and it's right here. But here's what's happening. instead of saying display block, we're saying display flex. And that is referring to something in CSS, it's baked into the language, what's known as flexbox. So in other words, whenever you use display flex, you can see that it's assigned to this div because it's acting like a parent element here on line 56, meaning anything inside that div is going to be treated as a flexible element because of that one little display property right there in line 35. The next few things we do for that div is we define its width as 100%. So it should behave as if it's that invisible box, that div, is spanning to the width of the browser. We give it a height of 250. Okay, so that's the same size as the physical image. Okay, well, I may not need to do that, but I had to just in this case to kind of demonstrate best practice. So in this case, I'm just saying, let's make it 250. The next class here, flex align, is really what makes that image, the second one in the browser, appear as if it's center aligned. And it's right here. It's the margin. So this is the same dang thing we just saw here in line 21, but instead it's written clearly. All four values are defined. And we remember how to do that. The first value is top. It's clockwise. Top, right, bottom, and then left. Okay, so you can see the right and the left are set to auto, so that is what's making that image over here, the second one, appear as if it is center aligned. So these two methods achieve the exact same thing. The second method is a little more contemporary because it gives us more flexibility if we were to add anything else inside that parent div element. That's really the only reason in this case. Whew! Okay, we're cruising along. Let me just get back over to our PDF and talk about one more thing for today, and that is the gradients in CSS. Very popular thing for background on sites, or else text. Sometimes you might see a gradient used inside a font. Boy, I could go on and on. Buttons, for example, use gradients. But gradients themselves are pretty high maintenance. However, I'm going to show you a very easy way to create gradients without having to code for it from scratch. The example that I'm going to show you has a lot of different types of gradients, and I did that just so you could copy and use that in your own project. But for right now, let me go back over and we'll talk about gradients in terms of code first, and then I'll show you how to create it really easily. Okay, so we're in brackets. We're on number 4 here, gradient. And if I scroll through that page, you can see, oh my gosh, yeah, there's different ways in which you can create gradients. Here's a multicolor gradient at the bottom. Okay, this one right above it looks like it's coming in from the corner here, the top right corner. We have another one here coming in from the right to the left, from the bottom to the top, okay, and then so forth and so forth. So let's just take a look at this first one here. I'm not going to talk about it in great detail because I wrote all of these notes for you in case you're curious. But on line 8, that's really where I wanted to start. This is one ID called gradient, and you can see all of the different properties here that make up that gradient. So it's pretty verbose in terms of how to explain it. I'll do my best to kind of give you an idea why there's so many properties for one little gradient image. All right, so just kind of like what we've learned with color, we've also learned with typography. That is, sometimes we need to have a fallback color for a gradient if the browser is unable to interpret our properties, meaning background image in this case. So we start with a background color. Okay, if I hover over that, the first gradient we're really focused on in the browser is this topmost one right here, this aqua looking gradient. So my background flat color is this aqua hexadecimal color here. And then we'll get to line 15. And line 15 is very similar. And if let's say the background color is kind of a safeguard, it's our fallback color, well, we also need to consider if the browser does support an image, that we can give our gradient a backup plan for how that's going to render. In this case, we have a fallback image that appears as a gradient. Let me get over here and see if we can find it. Fallback image. Oh boy, I'm not seeing it. Woo, where'd you go? I think I was demonstrating this and forgot to put it in our folder today. Oops. Okay, I'll need to do that. Anyway, our fallback image would go here in this case. And that is just saying, hey, if the browser can't support our background images for the gradient, it's going to load that image in place of the vector gradient itself. Line 20 is, again, we have a background image property, and this is actually the gradient itself. Okay, the property says MOZ, linear gradient. And if I hover over that in brackets, you can see I got to get a nice little swatch of what that gradient looks like. The first color, of course, is right here. They're both hexadecimal. They're separated by a comma. And what I wanted to talk about was this MOZ, this funny little thing right here. Well, that stands for Mozilla Firefox. So Firefox has a different way to interpret gradients versus, let's say, Chrome versus, let's say, Safari. So if you scroll down below, that's exactly what these are right here. They're loading the exact same gradient, but a very different way in terms of how we write for it in CSS. If you see something like WebKit, that is typically Safari and Chrome. And if you see O, that is for Opera. So again, these are the rendering engines in the browser, but these are the kind of the prefix that you would add to the way in which you write that gradient for that browser. So think of these last properties right here as writing the exact same type of gradient, but very different ways for specific types of browsers, so that we accommodate all browsers for whomever is using that browser. They should be able to see our gradient as it is. In this case, it's at Aqua. The last two things we need for a gradient, of course, just like we would with a div, is we need to give it physical presence. So in our case, we have a height of 350 and a width of 600. Okay, so blah, 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 right? That's a lot to do just for one little gradient. But to make your life a little easier, you can create gradients in Adobe Illustrator or Adobe Photoshop. I'm hoping to have about 3 minutes here to show you that right now. Before I do, wanted to stress that this next set of CSS is for all the other gradients you see here. And you can see a much lighter weight in terms of how those are written. So you can use these if you like in your own site. But for right now, I'm going to focus on the little comment we have here on line 94. First thing it says is go ahead and uncomment lines 103 and lines 111. Okay, that's going to make this style element alive. So I'm going to go ahead and say File, Save. Okay, so nothing happened. All we're doing, however, is you'll notice that we're reusing that same ID gradient as we had way up here. And instead, we're going to overwrite it. So this is how we're going to do it, though. We're going to use Adobe Illustrator first to do that. Okay, so let me slow down. We're going to go back to our folder, today's folder, week 12, and you'll see that I have a folder in there called Creating Gradient Examples. And there are two. Let me zoom in so you can see that. Okay, AI Gradient Example copy. I'm going to go ahead and open that in Adobe Illustrator. And we're just going to focus on Illustrator today. But you can do the same thing, and I might show that in Photoshop as well. Okay, so quickly, let's work. Let's say we're in Illustrator and we use the rectangle tool and we created this box here. I'll just go ahead and select that. That's all that is. And it's been applied. It has a gradient applied to it right now. So if I go to the gradient window, you can probably see that for yourself. Okay, there's my gradient. That's all I did. Now it's set to transparent. But let's say I wanted to use this gradient as my background for my website. How do I get the code for that? Okay. To do that, you're going to go up to Window, and you'll see a window there called CSS Properties. And I think we've done this once before. We're going to do that one more time. Okay. I'm going to select that window. And The first thing you need to do when you use this kind of method is you need to select the export options in that window. Okay, so I'm in the CSS properties. Here I'm going to select export options. And the one thing that I just need to make sure it is selected is the middlemost option there that says generate CSS for unnamed objects. If that's not selected, you won't get the code that you need for this type of gradient method. Okay, you can see there are our vendor prefixes: WebKit, Firefox, Internet Explorer, Opera. Okay, remember those weird little WebKit O and Moz? Yeah, there they are. I can select those two here for gradients. That makes it a lot easier for me. I'll go ahead and say okay. And then there is my vector object with a gradient and the CSS for that gradient. Now, Illustrator's a bit weird because you would think I'll just go ahead and highlight this and choose edit, copy, okay. But instead, you're gonna wanna choose the little button down below. It is right here, copy selected style. So let me do that right now. What that's gonna do when I select that button, you can see it highlights the code and copies it for me. Okay. My mouse is acting a little weird. There it goes. I should, if I head back over to brackets, be able to paste that code inside my gradient ID right here, just like this. Okay, there's a few nuances that I need to kind of refine and make clean up there, so let me do that. Okay, so I'm not quite done. You'll notice that when I pasted, it pasted a class name with all of the properties in its own little selector. So I just need to delete a few things. I need to delete these little curly braces here, and of course the name. Okay, I don't need that because it's now in an ID. And I need to be sensitive that, oh, okay, there's the last one there down below. I need to delete that too. But you can see how easy it is now. If I go ahead and said File, Save, you probably just saw that topmost gradient change in the browser here. Well, that's because our gradient ID and the properties we just pasted, those are overwriting the old gradient up here. So yeah, it did work, and that's really nice. You can see that it saved me so much time from having to write all of these background properties one by one to accommodate all those different types of browsers. So if you're thinking about gradients, that's the easiest way to do it. Create a simple object in Illustrator in this case. Copy that code using the CSS properties. Bring it back into your CSS style sheet here, and voila, you have a nice gradient that you can manage on your own. Okay, that's it for today. I'm gonna go ahead and close out these files, and we'll go back to our schedule one more time. And again, there is a way to do that in Photoshop, that is create gradients. But in this example here, that file that I have provided for you, I put a little note in there to show you how to do that in case you want to learn how to do that. But since some of us may not have Photoshop, that's why I showed you how to do that in Illustrator. I know, can't guarantee everything. Okay, let me close these out. Close that out. I'm going to go back over to our schedule here. I can close out our lecture slides. And today's goal, of course, is to continue our page design of our site. That is just our home page in either Photoshop or GIMP. I'm having us use a raster-based software just because this really is a design prototype of what the home page will look like for your project. So I think to conclude for today, if you have started that from last week, or at least if you made some progress by this week, you can let me know that you have something to show if you want that feedback, because you'll notice that we have a due date for that page design by Wednesday night. Aha. Okay. So reach out to me if software's giving you a headache, or if you do have something and want feedback, let me know. I'm just going to go back over to our Google Drive right now and show you kind of how I'm facilitating that between you and I. Okay, so in your feedback folder, what I have done is I have kind of a way in which I manage that myself. So all of your feedback folders are in this folder here, R349. You would just simply drop your files in your own folder, email me, or you could text me. Sometimes I'm not that quick to respond on text, but just a heads up. That way I know that you need feedback. I can look at your files and then I can just write some notes in your feedback folder. And that's the kind of exchange that we're going to expect to do. Okay, well, that concludes today's lesson. I know that's a bit wordy. I'll do my best to try to use my words carefully here. But again, we're at week 12, day 1, and we're talking about images in CSS. Have a good day.